It was a warm Tuesday afternoon in the capital. The sun dipped low behind the marble buildings, casting long shadows across the steps of justice. On a quiet street not far from the Supreme Court, an elderly man in a tailored gray suit walked slowly toward his parked car, cane tapping rhythmically on the pavement. He moved with the calm confidence of someone who'd seen the world change 1,000 times and yet never stopped standing tall. As he reached for the door handle of his luxury sedan, a sharp voice cut through the air. "Excuse me, sir. Step away from the vehicle." The man turned. A patrol officer approached briskly, one hand resting near his belt. "Can I help you, officer?" the elder asked, raising an eyebrow. "I need to see some ID," the officer said flatly. "This car doesn't look like it belongs to you." The old man paused. "And what makes you say that?" he asked calmly, though there was no mistaking the steel in his voice. "I said I need your ID," the officer repeated, louder now. He glanced around, as if expecting backup. The man sighed, reaching slowly into his jacket. "Very well," he said, "if you insist." He handed over a leather wallet with the seal of the United States embossed in gold. The officer flipped it open and froze. His eyes widened. "J. Justice Williams?" he stammered, blinking at the badge. "Yes," said the elder, his voice cool. "Justice Harold Williams. United States Supreme Court." For a long moment, the officer didn't say a word. The name on the identification felt heavy in his hands, as if it carried not just weight but history. I didn't realize," he said, his earlier confidence dissolving into awkward silence. Justice Williams took back the wallet and slid it into his jacket with practiced ease. "No," he said quietly, "you didn't." The officer shifted on his feet. "Sir, I thought maybe, you thought I didn't belong next to a car like this," the justice interrupted, finishing the sentence for him. His voice wasn't angry, but it was firm, disappointed more than anything else. "You didn't stop me because of a stolen vehicle report. You didn't see me reaching for a weapon. You just saw someone who didn't fit the picture you had in your head." The officer looked down at the sidewalk. Williams continued. "I've spent my life studying the law, interpreting it, defending it. I've seen every kind of case, misjudgments, abuse of power, even good people making poor decisions. But the hardest thing to witness, even after all these years, is how quickly some people make assumptions before they ask questions." A gust of wind rustled the leaves along the curb. Cars passed quietly in the distance, unaware that a quiet lesson was unfolding on this quiet street. "I don't need an apology," Williams said after a pause. "What I need is for you to think, officer. Every interaction is an opportunity to do better. Every assumption is a choice. And choices have consequences, sometimes not for you, but for the person you're choosing to misunderstand." The officer finally met his eyes. "You're right, sir. I wasn't thinking clearly. I let the wrong things guide my reaction." Williams nodded, not unkindly. "We all make mistakes. What matters is what we do after them." For a moment, there was only stillness. No sirens. No handcuffs. Just two men standing on opposite ends of power, perception, and experience. "May I go now?" the justice asked, with just a trace of irony in his voice. The officer stepped back quickly. "Yes, of course, sir. Please." Justice Williams opened the car door slowly and settled into the driver's seat. He paused for a second, his hand resting on the steering wheel, then looked back at the officer one last time. "You have a badge," he said. "But it's your judgment that makes you worthy of it. Don't forget that." The car engine hummed to life. With one smooth motion, the vehicle pulled away from the curb and disappeared down the street, leaving behind a silence that wasn't empty, but full of reflection. That night, Officer Daniels sat alone in his apartment, staring at the badge on his kitchen table. It looked the same as always, polished, solid, a symbol of authority. But now it felt different. Lighter somehow. Or maybe it was just his own sense of certainty that had shifted. He replayed the moment again and again in his mind, the way Justice Williams had stood there, calm and composed, his voice never rising. There had been no outrage, no shouting. Just truth. Truth wrapped in disappointment. Daniels rubbed his temples. He hadn't meant to offend. He hadn't meant anything at all, really. That was the part that troubled him most. The encounter hadn't come from malice, it had come from a habit. From thoughtlessness. The next morning, he filed a report, not because he was required to, but because he felt he should. It was short, direct. It acknowledged what happened. And it included one line that stood out: assumptions made without cause erode the very trust one am sworn to protect. To his surprise, the department's internal ethics board called him in for a meeting. Not disciplinary, but reflective. Constructive. They had already heard about the encounter. Apparently, Justice Williams hadn't filed a complaint, but word had spread anyway. He didn't press charges, the captain said. He didn't call a press conference. He just let the moment speak for itself. Daniels nodded. It did. Later that week, a small op-ed appeared in the city newspaper. The byline read Harold Williams, Associate Justice of the United States Supreme Court. The article didn't name the officer, nor did it dwell on blame. Instead, it offered a meditation on dignity, awareness, and what it means to be seen, truly seen, by those in positions of everyday authority. Perception shapes reality. An unchecked perception, especially when left unspoken and unexamined, becomes a quiet policy unto itself. The piece was shared widely. Across legal circles. Among law enforcement forums. In classrooms, where civics teachers printed copies for their students. It didn't trend like a scandal. It resonated like a lesson. Meanwhile, Daniels made some changes. He enrolled in a voluntary training course focused on bias and decision-making. He requested a mentor from a different district. He listened more. Spoke less. He started greeting people not just with questions, but with context, and with time. The badge still sat on his uniform. But now, behind it, lived a more deliberate awareness. Justice Harold Williams sat by the window of his study, the sun streaking across his bookshelves in quiet golden beams. Outside, the sound of summer cicadas buzzed faintly, and in his hands rested a well-worn leather journal, one he hadn't opened in years. He turned the pages gently, fingers moving over ink from a younger version of himself. Law school notes, personal letters, courtroom sketches, and tucked between them, a faded photo, black and white, of him as a young man standing on courthouse steps. Eyes full of fire. Jaw clenched with purpose. He smiled at it, then placed the photo back. The encounter with the officer earlier that week hadn't shocked him. Not really. After decades in public life, after marching, ruling, dissenting, and writing opinions that would be dissected by generations, he had learned that change, while inevitable, was never finished. But it had stayed with him. The look on the officer's face. The quiet in that moment of recognition. It wasn't vindication he felt. It wasn't pride. It was weariness. He leaned back in his chair and let his mind wander back through time, to his first courtroom appointment in a small southern town, where local officials didn't shake his hand. To the whispered conversations at universities when he'd been named to the bench. To the smile on his mother's face the day he'd been sworn in as a federal judge, the same day she said, "You're not just breaking barriers, baby. You're surviving them." He remembered the way she'd held his face in her hands. A knock on the door stirred him from his thoughts. It was his clerk, a young woman fresh out of law school, sharp, optimistic, still untouched by disillusionment. "There's a message from the officer," she said. "The one from the street. He sent a letter." He took the envelope, turning it over slowly. The handwriting was neat. Honest. He opened it. Justice Williams, thank you for your composure that day. It taught me more in 10 minutes than most courses ever have. I hope to carry that moment with me into every decision I make from here on out. With respect, Officer Daniels. Williams folded the letter, eyes lingering on it for a moment. Shall I file it? His clerk asked. He shook his head. No. I'll keep it right here. He tucked it into the back of the journal, beside the old photograph, past and present, side by side. As the day faded into evening, he returned to his writing, not legal briefs this time, but a letter of his own. Not to courts or colleagues, but to a former student now teaching high school law in Detroit. He ended it with a thought still echoing in his mind: justice doesn't begin in courtrooms. It begins in recognition. In slowing down before we judge. In seeing one another clearly, even when the world tells us to look away. 3 months later, in a quiet high school classroom on the edge of Detroit, a group of students gathered around a projector as their teacher pulled up an op-ed titled, "The Space Between Assumption and Truth." The author's name, Justice Harold Williams, drew a few murmurs, even among teenagers who didn't often pay attention to judicial matters. Their teacher, Ms. Reed, smiled. "I want you to read this slowly," she said. "Not because it's law, but because it's life." The students settled into silence, reading. The words spoke not in commands, but in reflections, about patience, about judgment, about the quiet power of seeing someone for who they truly are. One student, a boy who usually kept to himself in the back row, raised his hand. "This really happened?" he asked. "Like, recently?" Ms. Reed nodded. "It wasn't a headline. It wasn't viral. It was just, real. One man misread another. And the one who was misread chose to teach, not punish." The boy leaned back in his seat, his expression thoughtful. In another part of the country, Officer Daniels stood outside a community center, adjusting his tie nervously. He had been invited to speak, not as a cop, but as a guest on a local panel about ethical decision-making. The flyer read, "Moments that shape us." Inside, the audience was modest. Parents. Students. A few city council members. No cameras. No reporters. Just people. He began his talk with honesty: "I made a mistake. But someone gave me the space to recognize it before it hardened into something worse." He didn't name Justice Williams, out of respect. But he carried his words with him, quoting that single line that had changed him most: "Every assumption is a choice." At that same hour, in Washington, Justice Williams sat in chambers, quietly reviewing a draft of his final majority opinion before retirement. His clerk looked up. "Hard to believe it's almost over," she said. "It's not over," he replied, glancing out the window. "It just continues in other hands." He picked up a pen and signed the opinion, a ruling that would expand due process protections for everyday citizens during street-level interactions with law enforcement. Later that evening, walking home past the same street where the encounter had occurred, he paused. The leaves had begun to change. A new season was coming. He stood there for a moment, not out of memory, but out of hope. Somewhere out there, a younger officer might pause before making a decision. A teacher might share a story that shifts a perspective. A student might see himself not as someone judged by the world, but as someone capable of judging fairly. The quietest changes are often the most permanent. Justice Williams smiled, then turned, and walked on. 1 year later, the name Justice Harold Williams was engraved onto the wall of the National Judicial Hall of Honor, a quiet corner within the Supreme Court, where only the most influential legal minds were memorialized. The plaque didn't list every landmark decision, nor every accolade. Instead, below his name, were just 3 lines: interpreter of law. Guardian of grace. Believed in the quiet strength of restraint. Saw beyond titles, and taught others to do the same. People passed by it every day, students on tours, visiting clerks, legal scholars from around the world. Some stopped to read it. Others didn't. But the ones who paused often lingered longest. In Detroit, Ms. Reed's classroom had changed. She had added a mural on the back wall, a silhouette of a judge standing beside a police officer, both looking toward a city skyline. Underneath it, the words, "Justice begins with how we see one another." Her student, the boy who once sat silently in the back, had begun volunteering at a local legal aid clinic. He said it was just a summer thing. But when asked why he chose it, he said simply, "I figured I'd rather help people before things go wrong." Meanwhile, Officer Daniels had applied for a new role, not a promotion, but a community liaison position. He led listening sessions, held workshops with young cadets. He was no longer haunted by his mistake. He had grown from it, not in spite of the moment, but because of it. He kept Justice Williams' op-ed framed in his office, right above his desk. One afternoon, Daniels received a small package. No return address. Inside, a handwritten note. "Dear Officer Daniels, we don't always get to choose the moments that define us. But we always get to choose what we do with them. Thank you for choosing reflection over defense, and growth over pride. That's not just honorable, it's rare. Be well, H.W." Back in Washington, on a quiet Sunday, a young girl held her grandfather's hand as they walked up the Supreme Court steps. She had just started reading about the Constitution in school. He had promised her a visit. They paused by the plaque bearing Justice Williams' name. Was he important, she asked. Her grandfather smiled. Yes. But not because of the job he had. Then why? Because he never forgot the people it was meant to serve. Especially the ones others might overlook. She stared at the plaque for a long time. And in that silent moment, somewhere between memory and promise, the story of Justice Williams lived on, not in headlines or history books, but in the softened heart of a child, the renewed purpose of a patrolman, and the enduring echo of a lesson given gently, at just the right time. 5 years had passed since Justice Harold Williams took his final walk up the marble steps. He had lived quietly in retirement, occasionally giving lectures, writing a few essays, and meeting with young legal scholars who sought not only his wisdom, but his presence, calm, steady, and unshakable. When he passed, the nation mourned with reverence, but not noise. Just as he would have preferred. There were no grand parades. No lavish memorials. Just a sunrise service held on the steps of the Supreme Court, the same steps where he had once stood as a young lawyer, underestimated but undeterred. People came from everywhere. Law students, professors, judges. Yes, there were dignitaries. But there were also janitors from the courthouse, bus drivers who'd driven him to work, a man who had once met him in a bookstore and never forgot the conversation. And in the front row stood Officer Daniels, now Sergeant Daniels, his badge weathered, his posture straighter than ever. Next to him was Ms. Reed, who had flown in from Detroit with 2 of her former students, both now in pre-law programs. The eulogy was simple, delivered not by a politician or a justice, but by William's granddaughter, the same girl who once asked, was he important? She spoke softly, my grandfather believed the law wasn't just about rules. It was about listening. Slowing down. Asking better questions. He never raised his voice, but the weight of his silence could move mountains. He once told me that greatness wasn't what you did when everyone was watching. It was how you treated someone when no one expected anything of you. That is how he lived. That is how he changed the world. After the ceremony, as people filtered away, Sergeant Daniels stayed behind. He walked to the plaque inside the hall one more time. He placed a small item beneath it, a folded piece of paper. The same letter Justice Williams had once written him. Now yellowing at the edges. He added a line to it in his own hand, still choosing reflection. Still listening. As he stood in the quiet hall, a young officer approached him. She looked nervous. Sir, I read the op-ed, the one from years ago, she said. About the man stopped on the street. I wasn't sure if it was real. Daniel smiled. It was. And I'm still learning from it. She nodded slowly. I want to do this job right. Then start with this, he said, looking her directly in the eyes. Every person you meet, see them fully, not partially. Let presence outweigh assumption. The two of them stood for a moment in silence, not out of grief, but out of quiet responsibility. And somewhere far from marble steps and engraved names, another teacher would soon tell the story again, to another group of students, in another city, because the lessons of one man's restraint, one man's courage to teach without condemnation, would never stop moving forward. Even when his footsteps had faded. 2 years after the sunrise service, the wind moved softly through the campus of a small liberal arts college in Virginia. Under an old oak tree, a student sat alone on a bench, flipping through a slim, cloth-bound book. The title was simple, Seeing Clearly, Essays on Justice, Power, and Human Assumption, by Harold Williams. It had been published posthumously, a collection of short reflections, courtroom anecdotes, and personal letters. No legalese. No footnotes. Just clarity and story. It had quietly become required reading in sociology, ethics, and criminal justice programs across the country. The student under the oak tree, her name was Maya Delgado, had never met Justice Williams. But his words had helped her through a difficult time. During her second year in the criminal justice program, she'd been pulled aside at a routine traffic stop near her hometown. She hadn't done anything wrong, but the experience rattled her, not because of what happened, but because of what almost did. She'd wanted to quit. To walk away from law enforcement entirely. But one line from Williams' book had stopped her: if you've been seen unfairly, don't leave the room. Stay, and become the person who changes how the next person is seen. She'd read it 10 times that night. Now, on the bench, she closed the book and stood, walking across the lawn toward a lecture hall where she'd been invited to speak, not as a student, but as a guest mentor for first-year cadets. Inside the hall, young faces looked up at her, notebooks open, some skeptical, some hopeful. She began, a long time ago, a man chose to teach instead of punish. He could have used his power to humiliate. Instead, he used it to reveal. He believed that silence, when paired with clarity, could reshape a heart. I'm here because that heart helped reshape mine. She spoke for 20 minutes. But the part they remembered most wasn't in her notes. It was when a student asked her, "Do you think things are actually getting better?" Maya paused. Then smiled, not with naivete, but with calm conviction. "They're getting clearer," she said. And clarity makes change possible. Outside the window, leaves stirred gently across the brick pathways. And far away, in libraries and lesson plans, in badge trainings and courtroom conversations, in soft-spoken officers and fearless students, the legacy of Justice Harold Williams, not as a symbol, but as a standard, continued its quiet work. Not by force. Not by fame. But by being carried forward, one clear-eyed decision at a time. Years passed. Buildings changed names. Curriculums evolved. Faces came and went. But the story, that story, never quite disappeared. It had settled into the foundation of many places now, not carved in stone, but whispered in lecture halls, replayed in quiet car rides, and reflected in personal decisions made without fanfare. At a police academy graduation in Chicago, a new class stood in formation. The keynote speaker, a young commander with calm eyes, stepped up to the podium. She didn't speak long. But she ended with something her former mentor, Sergeant Daniels, now long retired, had once told her. You will wear a badge. But before you use your authority, remember, the first power you hold is the power to pause. The second, to ask. The third, to see. And across the country, in a modest courtroom in North Carolina, a public defender cited a line from an old Supreme Court opinion as she stood before the bench. The judge nodded. He recognized it, not because of the legal precedent, but because it had been written by Justice Harold Williams. Assumption is not neutrality. It is a decision wearing plain clothes. That quote, now etched into law textbooks, wasn't remembered just for its clarity, but for the moment that birthed it. Not the courtroom. Not the chambers. A sidewalk. A routine stop. A pause that became a turning point. In a quiet garden behind the Supreme Court building, known only to a few, there is a small plaque beneath a dogwood tree planted in Harold Williams' memory. No statues. No marble. Just words. Justice is not what we say from the bench. It's how we choose to behave when no one is watching. Occasionally, a clerk or a student or a passerby will sit beneath that tree, take out a book, or just close their eyes. No selfies. No spectacle. But when they rise to go, they carry something with them, the faint, steady echo of a life that never shouted to be heard, and was never forgotten because of it.